In this video, we will talk about common answer traps in reading comprehension questions. Basically, you'll come out of this video understanding what makes a wrong answer choice wrong. So some different kinds of wrong answer choice traps you can expect. The first one is subtle, but what the test writers will do is they will take words that are from the relevant part of the passage in which you're going to answer the question from. They're going to take words from there and they're going to kind of twist them around and come up with a meaning that isn't in the passage. The reason why this is a trap answer is a lot of students gravitate towards the familiar words. So it's not just this word salad, but it's the actual meaning the words impart that are going to give us the right answer. Another answer trap is even more subtle. It's not in every question, but when it does show up, it can easily trick you. It is true, that is, the answer choice is correct for a different question. So you can easily go back to the passage and say, yeah, here's the evidence. This is exactly what it's saying. There's no twisting of meanings. However, if you read the question, it doesn't actually answer the question. So another way of thinking about it is it's true based on the passage, but it's in a different part of the passage. Then, as far as true goes, we even have the broader it's true, but it's not actually mentioned in the passage. It's almost commonsensical. It's a thing that most people know about the real world. And so we gravitate towards these answer choices, forgetting that our answer always has to be backed up with specific information in the passage. Another wrong answer trap is what I like to call the rotten spot. You know, when you buy a fruit, you typically make sure to look at the entire thing. So if I'm holding up an apple, I'm not just going to look at the shiny red part right in front of me. I'm going to want to make sure that the entire apple is red and shiny. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it in my hand and I'm going to turn it around. And that parallels what we should be doing with the answer choice, reading every single word, not just half of the answer choice and saying, oh, that sounds good, I like that, or even every word except for one, because all it takes is that one word to make the answer choice wrong. So be prepared for that. I should also mention that sometimes the answer choices are just flat out wrong. And you're not going to be spending your time going through all five of them very carefully. Oftentimes there's just two or sometimes three that are tricky. So the other two are usually just flat out wrong. Okay, let's take a look at a question here and apply this strategy. First off, this question is based on this passage here. So you might want to pause the video and read that. Okay, let's look at the question. The passage mentions how both hemispheres of the brain respond to injury in order to do what? So we look here and we can go down to the answer choices. And as soon as I get to A, you should say, hey, Chris, you just did something wrong. You didn't answer the question in your own words. And so you can see how important that is. And whenever we're dealing with these questions, even if you know the wrong answer choice traps, always make sure to read the question and answer it yourself based on the relevant text. So let's do that now. Again, the question is how both hemispheres of the brain respond to injury. Why? In order to do what? Well, read the sentence here. Moreover, scientists need to show that myelin regeneration is not the only significant factor to contribute to brain plasticity. It's not all about myelin regeneration. It's also about hemispheres. So plasticity can be defined as how well the two hemispheres work together. And so therefore, he mentions how the hemispheres of brains respond to injury to show that they can also be a measure of plasticity in the brain. Now let's look at A. Discuss how myelin regeneration may serve a greater function than previously thought. Well, that doesn't quite match up with the answer that we had, but it does look nice because it has myelin regeneration, which is right there in the sentence. But is the point of mentioning both hemispheres to show us that myelin regeneration may have a greater function? No, it's that these two hemispheres working in tandem have a greater function that may, of course, overlap with plasticity. And therefore, A doesn't impart the right meaning, but takes elements in the passage, familiar words, and twists the meaning. Let's look at B. Show that brain plasticity is not limited to one factor. It's not limited just to myelin regeneration, but to how the hemispheres communicate. So therefore, we have our answer. But we're going, of course, for wrong answer traps. So let's look at the other answer choices. Suggest that ODs might have a role in how the two hemispheres work. Now you can see that this is a little tricky because they're throwing in the word OD, or oligodendrocytes, is very common. But what? Well, I don't have the relevant text here, but you can go back to another part of the passage and you will actually get information that backs up this answer choice. However, it does not actually answer this specific question the way that answer choice B does. So yes, you can find evidence for C, but it doesn't answer this specific question. Therefore, it is wrong. D, highlight one way in which stroke patients recover. Well, it's mentioning both hemispheres in the context of brain plasticity and how the two hemispheres may contribute to that plasticity. It really has nothing to do with stroke patients recovering. Of course, that comes later on here, but that's giving us an example of the hemispheres and of that plasticity in the hemispheres. E, question the connection between ODs and the speed in which myelin is replaced. So what's going on here? Well, we have the idea that ODs, speed in which myelin is replaced, but we have this questioning here. Or is he really questioning what's going on here? And another way to look at it is to think, is that what the passage is talking about, the oligodendrocytes and the myelin? It's more about the hemispheres. And so you can see that this would simply be the wrong part of the passage. It may answer a question, it may not, but it's from a different part of the passage. That's similar to one of the other answer choices, C. And so it's important to note that you're not always going to get exactly the same answer traps per each question. Sometimes you'll have a smattering of them. Sometimes 2 or 3 may be flat out wrong in the easier questions. On harder questions like this one, you may get 2 that have the wrong part of the passage. You can actually find them in the passage, but they don't answer the specific question. Now, no, we're not quite done yet. What I decided was to try this out again, and this time give us a more difficult question in terms of the stem itself. This will allow us to practice the technique of simplifying. And I think when it's important when you go through these videos that you build upon the concepts. And so if you learned a concept in a prior video, you should try to apply it as much as possible to subsequent videos. And so we've learned about simplifying the question, and it's a pretty long question. What do we do in terms of simplifying it? Well, this is what I've come up with. Knowing how much human brain relies on both hemispheres is not a strong basis for knowing how OD is related to plasticity because. So I've taken this word explosion up here and I've made it a little bit easier. So make sure you read my simplified question. Hopefully it's simplified enough. If not, you may want to simplify this. Okay, now that we've done that, here is the relevant text. When we are done with reading the relevant text, remember, we don't want to just dive into the answer choices, but we actually want to answer this ourselves. So again, knowing how much the human brain relies on both hemispheres is not a strong basis for knowing how OD is related to plasticity because, well, it seems that OD itself can play a role in how the hemispheres talk to each other or communicate or operate. And so we can't say, oh, well, if we know the hemispheres are involved this much into, let's say, 40% in plasticity, the rest must be oligodendrocytes or ODs. If there's an overlap there, meaning that for both hemispheres to perform this task, they actually rely on OD, then it's difficult to use OD to determine plasticity. So therefore, our answer to the question is OD might play a part in how the brain uses both hemispheres. We go through the answer choices now, starting with A. Brain trauma is rarely related to one side of the brain. Now you might think, it's rarely limited to one side of the brain. Sure, that's what they talk about, right? They talk about it happening both places. Or maybe it was about the hemispheres working together in regards to one side of the brain. And so you start thinking your way through this, forgetting that you need to look back to the passage and back it up. And you need to, of course, match it with the answer that we came up with here. So A is wrong because simply it's not really mentioned in the passage, and don't bring in any common sense assumptions that if someone has brain trauma, it must affect the whole brain. Not mentioned in the passage. B, myelin regeneration might not be the only measure of brain plasticity. So we look up at our answer choice. B sounds great, but is it the same thing? ODs might play a part in how the brain uses both hemispheres. Myelin regeneration might not be the only measure of brain plasticity. This is a really tricky answer choice because it was mentioned. I actually brought it from the question we had before. It was the first sentence from the previous excerpt, but it makes such a tempting answer choice because it answers a different question, a question we more or less just had. And you can see that when you actually go through the GRE and you're answering these questions, you Answer one question, you answer two questions. On that third question, you're bringing information from the other questions. It's kind of lingering in your head. And so you have to be very careful. B sounds great, but it definitely doesn't answer the question. And remember, we've already answered the question ourselves, and it has to match up. The human brain is too complex for scientists to understand. This falls in the realm of, wow, commonsensical. I think we can all agree just how complex the brain is. Again, not based on this passage, and it's not the answer to the question that we are answering. Let's look at D. The ODs might be involved in how the brain uses both hemispheres. Look at our answer. OD might play a part in how brain uses both hemispheres. Very similar. Therefore, D is the answer. Finally, E. Only recently scientists have begun to use human brains to understand how new cells grow. Is that backed up in the passage? Do you think it maybe kind of suggests it, seems to somewhat? Well, that doesn't sound like a right GRE answer choice to me. And in terms of how new cells grow, it does mention new cells, but in terms of rat brains and mice brains, so definitely E is not the correct answer. Okay, so let's look at it a more general level, just to recap what's going on here. When you are dealing with these traps, know them. Watch this video again if necessary. Anticipate these common traps. Go through the actual GRE material and the official guide and practice on there. Go through their answer choices, pick the one that you think it's right, back it up, then look at the other answer choices. What kind of answer traps do you see? Of course, knowing these traps, and even going through this video 100 times, which of course I don't recommend, is not a substitute for actually understanding the passage. You still have to read, you still have to use your active reading techniques, your understanding of meaning and how ideas connect, all that stuff. That's paramount. And what's also paramount, or very important, is that you answer the question in your own words, at least as much as possible. Don't dive to the answer choices, and even if you start figuring out what kind of traps they are, you first have to figure out what the answer to the question is. Of course, and finally, I'll reiterate the fact that you don't actually have to spend your time always going through each wrong answer choice. That is pretty time consuming. It's really when you come down to 2 or maybe 3 answer choices and you're not quite sure. Like a second ago we had answer choice B that was really tempting because it reminded us of a different question, and of course we had D the answer. At that point you want to say, well, wait a second, can't have 2 right answers. Let me think of my common answer traps. Which answer trap is going on in one of these questions? Then you are definitely using this video and the information in here to your advantage. This video is about the primary purpose of the passage, or why did the author write the passage? That's essentially the question and what primary purpose means. So let's take a look here at this part that I've excerpted from the entire passage. Now, the reason I was able to home in on this is because primary purpose is usually located in 2 places. It is a combination of what you see in the first paragraph, which is often to give you context, and then most importantly what you find in the last paragraph, and that can oftentimes come at the very end of the last paragraph. What is everything driving towards? So we read the first paragraph, which I haven't excerpted here, but which essentially says that we've long known that the brain is plastic, but it's even more plastic than we maybe thought. So we get this part that comes now here at the very end of the last paragraph. To substantiate such a claim about plasticity, researchers must demonstrate more convincingly the relationship between the ability of existing human OD to replace old OD and the speed of myelin generation. Moreover, scientists need to show that myelin regeneration is not the only significant factor to contribute to brain plasticity. In other words, the primary purpose is to evaluate the study and then tell us that they're on the right track, but more needs to be done. So to discuss possible findings and ways in which those findings can be made more valid. Now it's really important that I come up with the primary purpose in my own words. The reason it's important is the answer choices are crafted in such a way that they easily distort our thinking. I oftentimes say, don't let the answer choices do the thinking for you. Nowhere is this more true, it seems, in the primary purpose questions, in which the answer choices are usually pretty vague, where all of a sudden you begin to misinterpret the passage if you read the answer choices without first putting in your own words the point of the passage. But we've done that here, so hopefully we can be on guard. Now, before we go there, I want to review really quickly 4 things to look for in the wrong answer types on the primary purpose. One is that the answer choice can be too general or vague, and that is it discusses the topic, but then has stuff that is just so unrelated or vague that it's not specific enough to actually tell us why the author wrote the passage in the first place. Just as something can be too general, it can be too specific. Sometimes great trap answers on primary purpose questions are those that are a good primary purpose or summary of just one of the paragraphs. So be careful not to choose something that's too specific or summarizes only one of the 3 paragraphs of a long passage. Next, we have that mention something that isn't in the passage. This is one that usually isn't as tricky because it brings in information that wasn't even mentioned. And finally, the rotten spot, which is a wrong answer choice that we've already gone over, is common on the primary purpose, where everything looks like it's going fine, and then they throw in a word or two towards the end that derails everything and makes that answer choice invalid. So let's take a look here at the primary purpose of the passage followed by 5 answer choices, starting with A. Discuss a new line of research and ways that it can improve our understanding of the way in which the brain functions. I kind of like this new line of research, sure, about how the brain is more plastic than we thought, but let's be on guard. Let's not try to say, oh, I like this about the answer choice, therefore it's correct. Put on our analytical hats and see if we can find what's weak or rotten in this answer choice. Ways that it can improve our understanding of the way in which the brain functions. Well, that's a little bit too high level. It's probably better in terms of our understanding of the way that myelin regeneration works. And more than that, it's about trying to understand if these researchers were on the right track. The purpose is to say they were, but they need to do more. And so this ways it can improve our understanding of the way in which the brain functions totally misses the point that it evaluated research and figured out or discussed ways the research could be improved. So A is simply too general, too vague towards the end there. B, question the results of the findings of a study by pointing out several oversights on the parts of researchers. Now, does he question the results of the finding? Sort of. He says they need to go a little bit further. But what are these so-called oversights? Does it mention these oversights in the passage? Now you may think, well, it doesn't, but there must have been some oversights because he doesn't agree with them. But his purpose is to show or to tell us what these researchers should do in the future to make their findings more valid. But he doesn't actually point out specific oversights. C, evaluate research findings and discuss ways in which these findings are flawed. Does he evaluate research findings? Yes. Do you stop reading when you get to there? No, you keep reading. Discuss ways in which these findings are flawed. Now, to say something flawed is to say it is wrong. He, however, or she, the author of the passage, says that the findings are tentative. More work needs to be done. That is not the same as flawed. Therefore, we go on to a different answer choice because we found that rotten spot, that word flawed, that one word that undid everything. Next, discuss a theory and offer up several reservations about the validity of that theory. Well, are they discussing a theory? More or less, that the brain is more plastic than we thought. And then does he offer up several reservations about that theory? Yes, about ways that it can be improved. Now, this doesn't perfectly match up with our answer choice that we thought of originally, but it's not perfect. And you're going to find this oftentimes on primary purposes. That's not going to be exactly what you were thinking or even that close. It's going to be slightly different. But if it's not wrong, it is oftentimes the best answer. So let's look at E. Is E better than D? Propose a theory in regards to how the brain is able to grow and regenerate after trauma. Now, this able to grow and regenerate after trauma is very specific to the third paragraph. It's more about the brain's plasticity. And of course, you can argue the brain's plasticity overlaps a lot of that regeneration after trauma. But wait a second, propose a theory? He actually evaluates a theory. He doesn't propose a theory. And therefore it confuses evaluating research with the people who actually did the research. So guess what? Therefore, D is our answer. And you have to be agile like that and not get rid of something right off the bat because it doesn't quite work. Again, we're looking for the best answer, And that's what will oftentimes happen in primary purpose questions, is you will have to find the answer that is best and the one, of course, that matches your answer of what the primary purpose was.
Okay, so today what we're going to be looking at is inference questions. And inference questions can be identified by a number of common key phrases that you can see here. Make note of those phrases because they'll help you recognize inference questions on test day. More importantly, though, let's talk about what inference questions really do and require of you. So an inference question requires you to identify an inference. Well, what is an inference? Well, there are two definitions of an inference. Outside of the GRE in real life, an inference can be just about anything. Anything that you think might be true based on information you've taken in. So that's the real-life definition of inference. Now, as you may have noticed, the GRE is not real life. And, of course, the GRE has different rules for inferences and what counts as an inference. So, in GRE reading comprehension, when you're asked to identify the inference among answer choices, an inference is something that is not directly stated in the text. So an inference will never simply be a restatement of something in the text. At the same time, although an inference isn't directly stated in a GRE RC passage, an inference can be assumed to be true based on the text. But we can take it further than that. GRE inferences aren't just kind of half presumed to be true, oh, this might be true. No, what it is GRE inferences are inevitably, inescapably true. They are the only logical conclusion you can draw based on the facts that are stated in the passage. So because inferences are the only logical extension of what has already been stated, they have a very close relationship with the statements that are in the passage. How close? Well, let's look at an example. So right here we have this example GRE reading comprehension passage about Galileo. And then we have three inferences, or proposed inferences, and you want to figure out which of these inferences actually would be inferences under the rules of the GRE. So, if you could, pause the video, read the passage, see if you can spot which of the inferences are correct and which are incorrect, and then we'll talk about this. Okay, hopefully you've looked over everything by now. So let's take a look at each of these proposed inferences. The first one, Galileo's telescope was too small to detect the motion of any planet in retrograde. Well, they talk about Galileo's small telescope. So far, so good. And they say the motion of the planet was too slight to be detected by Galileo's small telescope. Well, what's the planet? The planet is the planet Neptune. So here we have Neptune. So what we do know is that Galileo's telescope was too small to detect the motion of Neptune in retrograde. Now the question is, does Neptune equal any planet? Well, here in real life, you could make an inference that Neptune is a planet, all planets have certain recognizable traits in the sky, maybe they all behave similarly enough in retrograde that Galileo's telescope couldn't detect any planet. But on the GRE, that's too much of a leap. The passage does not explicitly say that Neptune and all of the other planets were equally difficult to detect because of Galileo's small telescope. So we're going to say that that's actually not a correct inference. Okay, so now let's look at number 2. Galileo showed no interest in Neptune after 1613. Well, let's scan the passage for where 1613 is mentioned. Okay, so we see 1613 in this first sentence, and we see that Galileo's drawings show that he observed Neptune in 1612 and again in 1613. And this really implies, they're listing just two things, in 1612 and 1613. This implies that these are the only two times that Neptune was put in Galileo's drawings. We have both those occasions and nothing more. So, does that mean Galileo showed no interest in Neptune after 1613? Well, if his drawings are the only indication of his interest in something, then yeah, that would be correct. And again, this is a larger leap, a kind of thing you might feel comfortable inferring in real life, but not so fast for a GRE inference. Because for a GRE inference, remember, you have to have a direct logical extension of the passage. It's the only conclusion you could reach. And here, it's not the only conclusion you could reach. You could think, oh, Galileo's drawings are the only indication of his interest, or you could think, well, Galileo may have expressed interest in other ways. So because we have that word interest, it's not a direct connection to the idea of drawings, and this again is not a correct inference. So let's get to the third one. After Galileo's initial observation of Neptune, someone else became the first to identify Neptune as a planet. This is correct. This is a GRE inference. And the logic, well, it always will be direct. It's not always readily apparent. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look carefully at why this is the only logical extension of something you see in the passage. We can see that this is a true inference based on the first paragraph. So let's take a closer look at that. So the true inference, again, is after Galileo's initial observation of Neptune, a different scholar became the first to identify Neptune as a planet. And why is that the case? Well, let's look at this. This is a true inference. Why? Because Galileo is said to have not been credited with Neptune's discovery because he failed to identify Neptune as a planet. And let's look at that in the passage after seeing that in this first sentence of my explanation here. So, it says that Galileo's drawings show he first observed Neptune, that would be the initial observation of Neptune here, in 1612. And it says that he observed it again in 1613 and then made a mistake. He mistook Neptune, and just by Neptune by its very definition is a planet. That's the definition of Neptune. He mistook it for a fixed star. And it said because of this, hence, he is not credited as the discoverer of Neptune. So, that implies something kind of interesting. It says he failed to identify Neptune as a planet, but otherwise he would have been heralded as Neptune's discoverer. So, if Galileo had identified Neptune as a planet, if he hadn't made that mistake, he would have been the discoverer. And that means that at the time there was no other discoverer who would receive credit, because if somebody else had discovered Neptune at the time that Galileo first observed it, well, it wouldn't have been possible for him to be credited as Neptune's discoverer under any circumstances. So Neptune had not yet been discovered when Galileo first observed it. So the discovery, and specifically the discovery that Neptune was a planet, must have come after that observation because nobody had been credited yet, and Galileo not realizing Neptune was a planet was the only thing that stopped him from being credited as a discoverer. So obviously somebody did that later because today we do know that Neptune is a planet. So again, this is a correct inference, and it is the only logical conclusion you can reach if you carefully read the stated facts in the first paragraph of this passage. So let's review the correct and incorrect inferences that I've linked to this passage. So, inference number 1, Galileo's telescope was too small to detect the motion of any planet in retrograde. Now, this is true if other planets show as little motion as Neptune when they're in retrograde, if they behave in a similar way so that the telescope would detect them in a similar way. However, don't think of it as true if. Think of it as incorrect unless this is true, unless planets are completely similar to Neptune in retrograde. So it's really incorrect unless this is in the passage, and it's not. So in statement number 2, Galileo showed no interest in Neptune after 1613. Again, we have a true if. This is true if Galileo's drawings are the only measure of his interest. So if drawings and interest are directly tethered together, this is true. But this is actually incorrect unless the passage says that drawings equal interest. And that's not in the passage, so it's actually incorrect. So we have 1 and 2 marked off. And now we have 3. And 3 is true because Galileo was going to be credited as discovering Neptune, and the only reason he didn't get that credit was he thought Neptune was a star, not a planet, which means that somebody else would have gotten credit later when they discovered Neptune was a planet. So, in other words, true because of some key ideas in the passage. So we have some true ifs, and if is never sufficient here. For reading comprehension inference questions, we have a true because of, and you always want to make sure that there's a specific because, this cause and effect. This is in the passage, therefore this is a true inference. So this leads me to a very important concept when you're dealing with inference questions in GRE reading comprehension, and that is that you want to look for becauses, not ifs, when you're selecting the correct inference. In other words, true if actually means incorrect. If you're saying, oh, this is true if this other thing is true, which I think might be true, but it's not in the passage, then you're really saying it's incorrect. That is not the correct inference you want to make. You want to say that something is correct because. A correct inference will never hinge on an if. Don't speculate. When you speculate that something is correct, if an idea that is not in the passage also happens to be true, you are making an inference that is not directly linked to something that is actually in the passage. So I want to repeat, true if really means incorrect unless. And if you can get the hang of that, if you can really get that into your head, you'll avoid most of the trap answers in GRE inference questions. However, there are a few other, well, two other kinds of really common trap answers in GRE reading comprehension inference questions, and we're going to look at those trick false inferences next. Okay, so we're back at this passage, and I want you to look at it again, and I want you to check it against the new inferences I'm suggesting might be valid. Read the passage, look at the inferences, decide whether they really are valid. So, pause the video, do that, and then we'll talk about this. Welcome back. Okay, so the newly proposed inferences are Galileo made drawings of Neptune for 2 consecutive years, and telescope technology today is far more sophisticated than it was in Galileo's time. Let's take a closer look at this. Okay, so we have Galileo made drawings of Neptune for 2 consecutive years. Well, that definitely seems in line with the passage. So you might say, oh, the passage demands this is true. This must be an inference. But remember, the passage has to demand something is true without actually directly stating it. Is that happening here? Well, not quite. So we have Galileo made drawings, and we have Galileo's drawings. Well, if Galileo possesses drawings, if these are his drawings, he made them. So this is just a paraphrase. These two underlined pieces are paraphrases of each other. The drawings are of Neptune, because the drawings show Neptune. So drawings that show Neptune and drawings of Neptune are the same thing. So again, we have paraphrase in the passage, and he did the drawings for 2 consecutive years. Well, 1612 and 1613, if you see that the drawings were made in those 2 years, you're not just inferring logically that they must be consecutive. They're consecutive by definition. It's a little bit too close. We're saying he made drawings in 1612 and 1613 and saying he made drawings for 2 consecutive years. For 2 consecutive years is just a less specific paraphrase of what's in the passage. So this is a paraphrase. A paraphrase. And a paraphrase is not an inference, at least not under the rules of GRE inference questions. So, paraphrase does not equal an inference. This is a paraphrase. Even though it's true to the passage, we have to mark it off. It's not a valid inference. Okay, so let's look at B. B says, telescope technology today is far more sophisticated than it was in Galileo's time. Well, it's hard to deny that's true. Galileo was around in the 1600s. And everybody knows that all kinds of scientific tools, including telescopes, are more advanced now than they were in the 1600s. But wait just 1 minute. The only mention of Galileo's telescope mentions that it was small. It doesn't mention that it wasn't technologically advanced enough. It doesn't mention or say anything that technology today would have done better. So while you can infer this, you're inferring that technology today is better than it was in Galileo's time, largely from your own common knowledge. You looked at 1 year in the passage, maybe 2 years, and you said, oh, we must be much more advanced by now. But you're inferring that from your own wisdom, from your own common knowledge, and not from the passage. So, common sense, or common knowledge, this also is not an inference. Remember, you want to infer something directly from the passage, a logical extension of the passage, not a logical extension of things you know, even if what you know is as basic and common sense as how time flows and how things change over time. So neither of these are valid inferences, and this is another way the GRE will try to Now, based on our exploration of that passage on Galileo, we can arrive at a few big ideas. And if you really internalize these ideas, if you understand them, you'll have really good accuracy on these reading comprehension inference questions. So first idea is that you don't want the correctness of an inference to hinge on an if. A GRE reading comprehension inference is not correct if an unstated assumption is true. The other big idea is that you do want the correctness to hinge on a because. You want to base your correctness on a concrete cause and effect reason. A GRE RC inference is correct because the passage directly states a certain thing is true, and the inference must also logically be true based on the stated fact. Big idea number 3, an inference is not a paraphrase. It's not just a paraphrase of a stated fact, but is instead a logical extension of a statement the passage makes. And then, big idea number 4, infer only from the passage. You don't want to use outside knowledge, even if that outside knowledge is obviously true. So, to recap, no ifs, focus on becauses, focus on, or avoid those paraphrases rather, and avoid using outside knowledge to make an inference. And those 4 big ideas should serve you well. With that in mind, we're going to look at a real GRE passage excerpt, or rather a real Magoosh GRE passage excerpt, and a full question, and we're going to see if we can use these big ideas to successfully navigate that question. Right, so like I said, we don't have a full passage here. We have an excerpt, which is the basis for a question. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is think of what you've learned in this video, read the excerpt, read the question, give it the best answer you can, and then we will look and see if you're correct. So pause the video, read, answer the question, and we'll talk about this. Right, welcome back. Let's take a look at the answers. Okay, so the first thing we want to say is that A actually is the correct answer. And what does A say? It says that when producing myelin, the human brain does not replace all of its oligodendrocytes at once. So, why is that correct? Well, replacing all of the oligodendrocytes at once, we see that toward the end of the paragraph. The oligodendrocytes are replaced, not some of them, the oligodendrocytes. So all of them are replaced when the animal needs to produce more myelin. So that's animal, not human. This is what happens in animal brains, and it says that's contrasting greatly with human brains. So presumably, if animals do something that contrasts greatly with what humans do, the humans are not doing what the animals do. So that's why that's correct. Okay, so let's look at B. B says only freshly replaced oligodendrocytes can produce new myelin in the human brain. Okay, so let's look at the passage itself. The passage says that oligodendrocytes are the cells that form myelin. So oligodendrocytes form myelin, but do they need to be freshly replaced? Well, in animals, they absolutely do. All of the oligodendrocytes are replaced every time an animal needs to replace myelin. So that's definitely the case there, but is it the case with humans? Well, it says that they lose those oligodendrocytes less drastically than animals do. They don't have a full replacement, but they could still be using replacing those cells because they need to replace them to make more myelin. Maybe. So this is incorrect unless human brains and those animal brains replace oligodendrocytes every time myelin is made. Maybe humans don't replace all oligodendrocytes every time myelin is made, but maybe they replace some. But we don't know that. This is incorrect unless that's explicitly stated in the passage, which it's not. Okay, so let's look at C. C. Oligodendrocytes provide other uses to the human brain besides the cells forming the myelin sheaths. Well, C again is clearly an incorrect answer because we've already marked A as correct. So, oligodendrocytes provide other uses to the human brain. Well, again, we see this opening sentence that we looked at before, that oligodendrocytes are the cells that form the myelin sheaths. There's no mention of oligodendrocytes doing anything else. We just see it associated with myelin. So this is incorrect unless there is an additional unstated purpose for oligodendrocytes, or rather, unless the statement would be in the passage, you have to mark it incorrect. So C is clearly incorrect. It's just not there. D. The oligodendrocyte life cycle in the human brain differs from that of some mammals. Okay, so we see oligodendrocytes do not perish. Well, perishing is a key part of the life cycle, so we can say that the idea of the way they perish is a paraphrase of the life cycle. And then it says this doesn't happen in the same way. Does not happen in the same way. That has to do with differs. So we're really seeing this as a paraphrase of the passage. So that is true to the passage, but it's not an inference. It's a paraphrase. E. The number of oligodendrocytes lost in the human brain changes in response to brain trauma. Well, this seems really true, like just per common sense. Obviously, if the brain is traumatized, certain cells will die that wouldn't have otherwise died. But again, common sense is not an inference from the passage. It's not an inference by the standards of GRE reading comprehension. So at this point, we have looked at the big ideas for how you can conquer these inference questions, and we've done a practice walkthrough of one passage, and then we've toured an actual full inference question to see how you did. I hope this has been helpful, and feel free to review this video and double check things as you're taking on those inference questions in practice.
In this video, we will talk about the detail question. What a detail question is it deals with a specific line or a word that shows up in a couple of lines, and your job is to describe what the question is doing. Now, this is quite a common question type. You typically see it more at the lower levels versus a question type such as inference, which tend to come up at the higher levels. What a detailed question looks like, again, is they give you a specific line reference or a specific word or words, and you have to go back to the passage and, of course, answer the question. In this case, where you have to actually look for the word, it may take a little bit of time, but don't worry, you don't actually have to remember the specific word or where it is in the passage. As long as you're scanning and you're looking for it, that should help. Now, if you've read the passage and actively have engaged yourself into the passage and the information, usually you'll have a pretty good sense of where that word shows up. Again, if you don't, simply scan. Now, there's some helpful strategies here. Once, of course, you've found the relevant part of the passage, it's important that you read the entire answer choice when you go back to the questions. You do not want to flub that because you missed a word or two. Because again, if any part of the answer choice is wrong, all of the answer is wrong. Now, when we're actually answering the question, it's important that we back up our answers with information in the passage. So don't start trying to reason or bring in unstated assumptions into your thought processes. Again, make sure you are clearly looking at the words in the passage. Once you've done that and you summarize the relevant part, then you can put the answer in your own words. Again, though, you're sticking to the text. Don't put the answer in your own interpretation. However, it's nice to use your own words because then you are less likely to fall for the traps that are awaiting you in the answer choices. So, what does this actually look like in the wild? Here is a detailed question. The passage mentions the red-tailed hawk in order to indicate what? Red-tailed hawk. That is the detailed word here. We're not given a line reference, but we scan back through the passage, and we end up at this part of the passage. I've reproduced a little bit more than necessary, but in general, with detailed questions, questions that give you a specific word or phrase or that specific line, always read a sentence above that line. If something is vague in that sentence above the line, then read above that sentence. Usually, though, reading up to the sentence where the word appears, in this case red-tailed hawk, will help you answer the question. So let's try that again, reading a sentence above. For the most part, they, if that's confusing, scan back there, scientists, found a consistent relationship. Dinosaurs grew not nearly as fast as modern-day endotherms, or not nearly as slowly as the peas, we'll call them, which all reptiles are. So we know dinosaurs do not grow as fast as modern-day warm-blooded animals. They give an example. This early flying dinosaur took 2 years to mature, whereas a red-tailed hawk, the important part, takes only 6 weeks to grow. So now thinking in our own terms, well, hawk grows really fast, the red-tailed hawk, and that's why he's mentioning it, to contrast the growth rate with that of a flying dinosaur, which is much slower, the growth rate. And so now we can go back to the answer choices, and we can see that he's not mentioning, A, that dinosaurs were cold-blooded. That's not why the red-tailed hawk was brought up. B, how birds share a similar clade with other dinosaurs. This is kind of jargony, meaning a non-typical word that shows up in the passage that you'll have to go back and find to remember what it means. And so in this case, I put a little squiggly line next to answer choices like B, meaning I can come back to it if nothing else works, but I don't want to waste my time trying to remember what a clade is. C, the way in which some modern-day animals differ from dinosaurs. This is tempting modern-day animals. It mentioned them and with the red-tailed hawk, and it mentioned the dinosaurs with the Archaeopteryx. But is that why he's mentioning the red-tailed hawk? Is that consistent with the answer that we came up with to talk about how, in terms of growth rate, modern-day animals are very different from the dinosaurs. So here it is a little bit too vague. There is no mention of growth rate. The way is a little bit general. Now, you may not be 100% sold on this being a wrong answer, and that's fine. Leave it there. The thing is, when you find an answer that matches your answer much better, after the answer that you came up with after reading the passage, then you can circle that with confidence. What you don't want to do is sit here on C and start convincing yourself that it is right. So we're going on to D. How markedly dinosaurs' growth rate differed from that of current species? Archaeopteryx grew much slower than the red-tailed hawk, and that's why they're mentioning the red-tailed hawk, to show how different the growth rate was between dinosaurs and more modern species. And so D is a slam dunk answer. C is wishy-washy. We don't want to spend time trying to make it work. B, we don't even have to worry what a clade is now. Doesn't matter. And then E, we don't have to worry about big jargony words like poikilothermy. We'll get rid of that. And again, the answer is D. So to recap, found out what the keyword is, scanned for that, found it in the passage, read a sentence above, got to the main part, thought about what I read in terms of the question, and I answered the question in my own words. Of course, that answer was based on what I just read. Came back to the answer choices and picked the answer that worked best, not dangling and hanging out here with a vague answer choice trying to make it work, but finding one that is clearly correct.